Blizzards don't just trap people, they trap emotions, thoughts, and choices you never imagined making. I learned that the hard way one freezing January evening at my grandfather's mountain lodge. Ethan, my fiancé, was called away for an urgent business trip at the last minute, leaving me to check on the lodge alone before the incoming snowstorm. Alex, his stepbrother, offered to help, saying he could use some fresh air. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but the storm arrived earlier than expected and the snow piled up so fast that leaving became impossible. The lodge's old heating system struggled and eventually failed, leaving only a weak fire to sustain us. By nightfall, it was nearly as cold inside as it was outside. "We need to conserve heat," Alex said, his breath visible in the dim light. Reluctantly, we gathered blankets on the couch and sat close together. At first it felt awkward, too personal, but as the night stretched on, the freezing air made us forget the discomfort. The storm howled outside, the snow falling relentlessly, and the fire dimmed to embers. Alex stood to add more logs. "This should keep us warm for a little while," he said, glancing at me. "But we need to stay close for body heat." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "You mean?" He shrugged, serious but understanding. "Just until the storm passes." I wanted to refuse, to insist we'd be fine, but the cold was undeniable and I knew he was right. "Okay," I said softly. Alex grabbed the thickest blankets he could find and draped them over the couch. I joined him, settling beside him with awkward hesitation. "Is this okay?" he asked carefully. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "It's fine." At first, the closeness was unbearable, physically and emotionally. I was hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, but as the hours wore on, the biting cold forced us closer. Eventually, I stopped noticing the tension. "Better?" Alex asked softly, his breath visible in the dim firelight. "Yes," I replied, though my voice trembled. Silence settled between us, only broken by the howling wind outside. Finally, Alex spoke. "The storm is worse than I thought." I nodded. "I haven't seen one this bad in years." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I used to love coming up here as a kid. My dad and I would stay for days, just the two of us." His mention of his father surprised me. Alex rarely talked about him. "You must have been close," I said. "Yeah," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He made this place feel like home." A pang of emotion hit me. I had tried to fill a similar role after getting engaged to Ethan, but I had always felt like an outsider. "I'm sorry if I haven't measured up," I said softly. Alex turned to me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I know I'm not part of your family the way your dad was," I stammered, "and I know having me in your life hasn't been easy." Alex stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached out and took my hand, squeezing it lightly. The simple gesture sent warmth through me, something deeper than body heat. "You don't have to try so hard," he said gently. "You already belong." Something shifted in that moment. Maybe it was the storm, the isolation, or just the raw honesty of the cold night. But as we sat together, wrapped in blankets against the freezing air, I realized that sometimes the strongest connections are forged in the harshest conditions, and sometimes the most unexpected moments reveal the truths we've been too afraid to face. He shook his head. "You've been good to me, Emily, better than I deserve." The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch. Time passed, and the fire continued to weaken. Alex shifted closer, pulling the blankets tighter around us. "Cold?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said, though my teeth chattered slightly. "Here," he said, wrapping his arm around me. At first I stiffened, but the warmth was undeniable. Slowly, I leaned into him as the cold retreated. "You're like a human heater," I joked, trying to ease the tension. He chuckled. "Guess I'm good for something." We sat in silence for a moment, the storm raging outside while the intimacy of the moment felt overwhelming. As the night wore on, I found myself growing more comfortable with Alex, and the barriers between us started to fall away. "Tell me something about yourself," he asked suddenly. I glanced up at him, surprised. "Like what?" "Anything," he said. "Something I don't know." I thought for a moment. "I used to want to be a painter," I admitted, "but life got in the way. Ethan had his career, and I let my dreams fall aside." Alex's expression softened. "You didn't have to give up what makes you happy." His words stirred something in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. "What about you?" I asked, changing the subject. "What did you want to be?" He smiled faintly. "An architect. I used to draw elaborate plans for mansions and castles. My dad always said I had the imagination for it." "What happened?" I asked. He sighed. "Life got in the way." His words echoed my own, and I felt an unspoken bond form between us, a shared sense of loss for dreams never realized. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight poured through the frosted windows, casting a golden glow on the snowy landscape. Alex was already up, stoking the fire to life. He glanced back at me as I sat up. "Morning," he said warmly. "Morning," I replied, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The awkwardness from the night before returned, but it was different now. More about the unspoken tension between us than discomfort. "We should be able to leave once the roads are clear," he said casually. "Good," I said quickly, though part of me didn't want to leave the warmth of the lodge. Later, as we packed to leave, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had changed something between us, or if I was imagining it. Returning home, I thought the tension would fade, but as we unpacked our bags and settled back into the familiar house, I realized something had shifted. Alex started avoiding me, retreating to his room or leaving the house for long stretches, only speaking when spoken to. I convinced myself it was for the best, that the distance would bring us back to normal. But I couldn't ignore how my stomach tightened every time I saw him in the hallway or heard his voice from another room. One evening, while I was doing the dishes, Alex walked in. He paused at the doorway as if debating whether to leave. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah," he said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to thank you for handling everything at the lodge." I dried my hands, surprised by his sincerity. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "You were the one keeping us alive." He chuckled softly. "Still, I appreciate it. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt the connection between us once more. The turning point came late one night. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts spinning. Wandering downstairs to make tea, I found Alex in the dimly lit living room reading a book. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone else to be awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, closing the book. "No," I admitted, stepping closer. "Too much on my mind." He nodded, shifting slightly on the couch. "Same here." I hesitated before sitting beside him, the warmth of his presence both comforting and unnerving. We sat in silence, the only sound the quiet crackling of the fire. After a moment, he exhaled deeply. "Can I ask you something?" he said hesitantly. "Of course," I replied. "Emily, about the lodge. Did it feel different at the lodge?" I swallowed hard. "What about it?" His gaze met mine, searching. "Did it mean anything to you? Or was it just the cold making us act differently?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was, I didn't know. Maybe it had been the cold, or maybe, just maybe, it had been something else entirely. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart raced as I considered my answer. "Yes," I whispered. Alex nodded slowly, dropping his gaze. "I thought it was just me." "It wasn't," I replied, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed felt deafening, but neither of us moved to break it. Eventually, Alex stood and sat beside me. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about it." "Me neither," I admitted, trembling. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. The kiss was tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, and I knew we had crossed a line. After that night, we tried to avoid each other, pretending nothing had happened, but the pull between us was too strong. One evening, after Ethan left for a week-long trip, Alex and I found ourselves alone again in the kitchen. The air between us crackled with tension. "We can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice wavered. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "No one has to know." "It's not that simple," I said, leaning against the counter. "It could be," he murmured, his hand brushing mine. When his lips met mine again, all my reservations melted away. Our relationship grew more complicated, and the secret we kept became harder to bear. I became hyper-aware of the people around us, especially Clara, who began to notice changes in my behavior. "You seem different," she remarked one morning, her eyes narrowing with concern. "More alive." I laughed, trying to brush it off. "I've just been getting more sleep." "Or maybe," she said, tilting her head, "there's someone or something you're not telling me about." She was teasing, but her eyes held a knowing sharpness. Her words stuck with me. The tension built, and Greg's curiosity about Alex grew. One evening, during a dinner party, Greg cornered Alex in the kitchen. "So, Alex," Greg said, swirling his wine, "what's it like staying here with Emily?" Alex stiffened, glancing at me. "It's fine," he replied cautiously. "Just fine?" Greg pressed, his voice light but probing. "She's a lovely woman." Greg smirked, and I excused myself before the conversation escalated. But I knew Greg suspected something. As time passed, our secret became harder to keep. Alex and I found ourselves sneaking around more frequently, stealing moments when we could. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Alex turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Emily?" he asked. I sighed, staring at the moonlit flowers. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just don't want to hurt anyone." "You're not," he said quickly. "But it's complicated." He reached for my hand, his grip firm. "I'm willing to take the risk if you are." His words sent a mixture of excitement and fear through me. I knew the stakes, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Our lives had become a double act. By day, we played the part of a normal family, with Ethan completely unaware. By night, we tiptoed around each other, sharing stolen moments that felt like treasures. The thrill was undeniable, but so was the danger. Each glance, each touch carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Who would notice? Who would tell? And what would happen when they did? One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, Alex and I were alone in the living room. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. I sat on the couch, lost in thought, as Alex leaned against the armrest beside me. His hand brushed mine. "Someone might come home," I whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Clara texted," Alex replied. "She's taking Tom to that fundraiser." His words gave me a sense of reassurance, enough to let my guard down, at least for a moment. But as Alex leaned in closer, the sudden sound of the front door opening sent a jolt of panic through me. "Emily?" Ethan's voice called from the hallway. We scrambled apart, my pulse pounding as Ethan walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his eyes darting between the two of us. "Just reading," I said quickly, holding up my book as if it could shield me from his gaze. Alex nodded, maintaining his calm expression. I was just about to head out. Ethan stared at us for a long moment, then shrugged. "All right." I thought I heard voices. Once he left the room, I let out the breath I had been holding. "That was too close," I whispered to Alex, feeling the weight of the situation. "Too close," Alex agreed, his jaw tight. The following days became more complicated. Greg's behavior grew more invasive, his curiosity about Alex intensifying after Ethan mentioned that his stepbrother was staying with us. One evening during a dinner party at our house, Greg cornered Alex in the kitchen. "So, Alex," Greg said, swirling his wine glass, "what's it like staying here with Emily?" Alex's posture stiffened and he glanced briefly at me across the room. "It's fine," he replied cautiously. "Just fine," Greg pressed, his tone casual but probing. "She's a lovely woman, isn't she?" Alex clenched his jaw. "She is." Greg smirked, clearly relishing the discomfort he was causing. "I hope you're not giving her too much trouble." Before the conversation could escalate, I stepped in, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Greg, do you mind helping Ethan in the dining room?" "Of course," Greg said with a half smile before leaving the room. Once we were alone, I turned to Alex. "What was that about?" "Nothing," Alex replied, though his expression told a different story. "He's just being Greg." but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg suspected more than he let on. As our relationship continued, it became harder to keep the secret from those around us. Alex and I found ourselves sneaking around more often, sharing stolen moments in the early mornings or late at night. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Alex turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Emily?" he asked again. I stared at the moonlit flowers, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to hurt you." "You're not," he said, but the weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. It's complicated." He reached for my hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "I'm willing to take the risk if you are." Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We continued our secret relationship, living a double life. Each moment of stolen affection made the stakes even higher. By day, we played the part of a normal family when Ethan was around, but at night, we navigated a world filled with secrets, always looking over our shoulders, wondering when everything would come crashing down. One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, Alex and I found ourselves alone again. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed to bring a sense of calm, but I knew it was just an illusion. Alex leaned beside me, his hand brushing mine again. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up," I whispered, my voice tinged with anxiety. Alex nodded, his expression grave. "We'll figure it out, but we can't keep pretending nothing's going on." Just then, the sound of the front door opening again made us freeze. "Emily?" Ethan's voice called from the hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach as we quickly pulled apart, the weight of our actions hanging over us like a cloud. Ethan walked into the room, oblivious to what had just happened. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two of us. "Just reading," I said, trying to keep my composure. I grabbed a nearby book, attempting to appear normal. Alex nodded in agreement, though his eyes held an underlying tension. Ethan gave us a curious look before shrugging. "All right." Once he left, I could feel the panic fading, but the guilt remained. Alex and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken words lingering in the air. We both knew this was only a temporary reprieve. As the days wore on, the tension continued to rise. Greg started noticing things, strange glances, awkward silences, and his curiosity became more apparent. Finally, it reached a breaking point when Ethan confronted me one evening. "Emily, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. I froze, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange," Ethan said, his tone growing more insistent. "And Alex, he's been acting strange too. Is there something I should know?" The weight of his words settled on me, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The strain of keeping our secret became unbearable. Alex and I had reached a breaking point, and the constant tension weighed on us both. Our stolen moments, the looks we shared, the closeness we tried to hide. It was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, after another close call, we found ourselves arguing in the kitchen. "This is getting too dangerous," I said, my voice rising. "Someone is going to figure it out." Alex stepped closer, his expression softening. "We can handle it." Can we? I countered, my frustration boiling over. It feels like everything is falling apart. Alex's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the same fears I had. I don't want to lose you, Emily. I don't want to lose you either, I admitted, feeling the weight of the situation. But even as we reconciled, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time together was running out. The breaking point came one afternoon when Ethan returned home unexpectedly during one of our secret moments. Alex and I had been in the garden, our voices low as we discussed our next steps. "We need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's getting too risky." "Do you really want to stop?" Alex asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Before I could respond, the sound of Ethan's voice made us jump. "Emily," he called out from inside. We scrambled apart, panic rising in my chest as I heard his footsteps approaching. "Just getting some air," I said quickly, forcing a smile as Ethan appeared in the doorway. His eyes narrowed, studying us both carefully. "What's going on out here?" "Just talking," I said, trying to keep the situation calm. Ethan gave us a suspicious look, but after a long moment, he shrugged. "All right," and then, without another word, he left the room. As I exhaled in relief, I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on us. "That was too close," I whispered to Alex. "I know," he agreed, his jaw tight with frustration. The next day, Greg's interference escalated even further. He showed up unannounced at the house, his demeanor smug as he greeted Ethan. "Greg," Ethan said, surprised by his sudden appearance, "what brings you by?" "Oh, just thought I'd check in," Greg said, his gaze darting between Alex and me, clearly studying us. "I've been noticing some interesting dynamics around here lately." My stomach sank at his words, but Ethan, oblivious to the tension, laughed it off. "Greg, you've always been one for gossip," Ethan said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's have a drink." As Ethan led Greg away to the study, I turned to Alex, my voice low. "We're running out of time." "I know," Alex said, his face grim. "But I'll figure something out." That night, Alex came to me with a plan. "I'll talk to Greg," he said, his voice resolute. "One last time." "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You can't trust him." "I'm not asking for his trust," Alex replied, his voice steady. "But if I don't do something, he'll ruin everything." Despite my protests, Alex left the house that night, determined to confront Greg and put an end to his threats. He met Greg at a bar far from our house, hoping for some semblance of privacy. "This is your last chance," Greg said, sipping his drink with an air of finality. "Leave town or I'll destroy both of you." Alex leaned in, his voice cold. "You think you can control me or Emily? You're pathetic." Greg's smirk faltered and he leaned in closer. "Careful, kid. You don't want to make an enemy of me." Alex didn't back down. "You already are." Greg stormed out of the bar, his threats lingering in the air. When Alex returned home, he was pale but determined. "It's done," he said. "What did you do?" I asked, fear in my voice. "Nothing illegal," Alex replied, though his tone was evasive. But the peace didn't last. The following morning, Ethan received an anonymous email with damning evidence, enough to unravel everything. He stormed into the kitchen, his phone clenched in his hand, his face pale with fury. "Emily," he barked, slamming the phone onto the counter. "What is this?" I froze, my eyes darting to the screen. The subject line was ominous. "The truth about your wife and your brother." Below it, a series of photos captured stolen moments between Alex and me. The captions were even worse, filled with venom and accusation. "This has to be a mistake," I stammered, my voice betraying me. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read the email. "Don't insult my intelligence, Emily. I've known something was off for weeks. Now I know why." Alex entered the room then, his face going pale as he saw the scene unfolding. "What's going on?" he asked cautiously. Ethan turned on him, his anger boiling over. "You know exactly what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife. Alex stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Ethan, just listen to me." "Don't you dare tell me to listen," Ethan shouted. "I welcomed you into my home, and this is how you repay me?" "It's not that simple," Alex said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "Not that simple," Ethan laughed bitterly. "You seduced her, didn't you? Manipulated her the same way you manipulate everyone else." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice trembling. "Ethan, please. Let's talk about this." Ethan cut me off, his voice cold. "I trusted you, Emily. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for him." The words struck me like a knife. But before I could respond, Ethan turned back to Alec. "You're no brother of mine. Pack your things and get out of my house." Before Alex could say anything, the doorbell rang. I froze, dreading the worst. When Ethan opened the door, Sabrina stood there with a smug expression. "Sabrina?" Alex asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I came to deliver the rest of the truth," Sabrina said as she walked past Ethan into the house. "What truth?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp. Sabrina pulled out her phone and played an audio recording for everyone to hear. It was Alex's voice, low and urgent. "Greg needs to back off. If he doesn't, I'll make sure he regrets it." The room fell silent as the recording ended. Ethan turned to Alex, his gaze filled with suspicion. "What does this mean?" "It's not what it sounds like," Alex said quickly, his voice defensive. Sabrina smirked. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Alex has been playing games with Greg, with Emily, with everyone." Ethan turned to me, his face filled with betrayal. "Is this true? Did you know about this?" "I didn't," I said, but the words felt hollow. "Don't lie to me, Emily," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Alex stepped between us. "Leave her out of this," he said firmly. "This is all about her," Ethan snapped. "You don't think I see that?" Alex's jaw tightened. "Maybe it is, but you drove her to it. You treated her like an afterthought while you chased your career." "Don't lecture me about my marriage," Ethan growled. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment I thought someone would strike. Just then, Greg entered the house without knocking, his expression wild. "What's going on here?" Ethan demanded. Greg pointed at Alex. He threatened me, said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep quiet. Alex stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You've been blackmailing us, Greg. Don't play the victim. Blackmail? Ethan repeated, disbelief written across his face. Yeah, Greg said with venom. Because you deserve to know what's been going on under your roof. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Finally, Ethan slammed his fist on the counter. Enough, he shouted. I don't care who started this. I want all of you out of my house. Now. I felt the weight of his words crushing me. Ethan, please. Save it, he said coldly. I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week. Alex's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of regret. I'll wait for you outside, he said softly before leaving the room. I stood on the porch watching Alex load his car, the ache in my chest growing. This wasn't how I wanted it to end. It doesn't have to end, Alex said quietly as he turned to me. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I can't, I said finally, tears streaming down my face. I've already lost too much. Alex nodded, his jaw clenched. I understand. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cold. In the days that followed, the fallout consumed me. Clara called repeatedly, concerned, but I couldn't face her. Ethan moved into a hotel, leaving the house eerily empty. I spent my nights staring out at the garden, replaying every choice that had led me to this point. The passion, the risks, the lies. They had all come at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time in years, I had felt alive, even if it had all ended in ruin.